Nobody got it, nobody understood it. But altruistically, what I think we've come up with is a theory that is heuristic for guiding people's research on narrative and storytelling, and then ultimately understanding human beings and helping them to fare better in the world and improve their well-being. So the theory itself starts out with this overarching notion of what we call communicated sense-making. And this refers to the ways people communicate to make sense of their relationships, lived experiences, identities, difficulties, and how the content and process of communicated sense-making affect and reflect health and well-being. So we're interested in how people communicate to make sense of their lives. With that, in our model, we've suggested that there are many, and this is certainly not an exhaustive list, like metaphor is not up here, which it certainly could be. But there are certain constructs that help us communicate to make sense. Things like memorable messages, messages that we've heard, that stick with us, and that guide our behavior in some way. Accounts, the ways in which we account for our behavior to other people when it's called into question, is a way that we communicate to make sense of our lives. Attributions are the explanations we give for our own or others' behavior, including the causes and consequences for behavior. And then communicated perspective taking, I'll talk about in a little bit, but is another area of our research in which people engage in ways that communicate that they can understand each other. At the heart of this, in the middle of the model, is another construct that we call communicated narrative sense-making. And this is essentially what we refer to when we're talking about narratives and storytelling. So this is the theory that I want to spend the most time talking about today, because it's been the theory that guides a majority of our work on the links between storytelling and health. So CNSM, that's a shorter, easier thing to say than communicated narrative sense-making, which is a mouthful and totally cumbersome and horrible, but it means something, is an empirical approach to understanding the ways in which narratives and storytelling affect and reflect individual and relational well-being. And I should have put in the family in parentheses, because ultimately we wrote this particular chapter for a family handbook, but I think that this applies more broadly than in the family. The two things that are most important that when I'm teaching this to my graduate students or my undergrads in class that I want them to take away is that this approach focuses on communicated sense-making. So there is a vast and wonderfully rich literature on narrative and storytelling across disciplines. But when I got interested in storytelling in my graduate program, I saw little research from a communication perspective on the process of storytelling itself, on the behaviors that characterized storytelling interactions, although there is some. I didn't see as much as I thought I might. And so we really felt that communication researchers are in a good position to shed light on these processes. And so all of our research in this area is focused on the communicated nature of narratives and storytelling. The theory is also grounded in those three functions that I mentioned in the story that I started with. So at the backdrop of this theory is the idea that life is narrative in nature, that we are storytelling creatures, storytelling beings who live and exist in the world through narrative means. So if you think about how many of you went home for the holidays? And when you had to describe how your fall semester was to your family, probably much of what you did was tell stories about it, right? Because a whole semester is a messy, complicated, probably roller coaster of emotion and joy and heartache and whatever. But when you have to go explain it to somebody else, we tend to, as humans, put those things in story form. So at the backdrop of this is that we're narrative creatures. And that also we tell stories with a number of functions in mind, either to create identity, which is creating both individual identity and relational identity. So Aubrey, when we were talking earlier, brought up this great point that we tell stories to connect with other people. So part of what we're creating when we tell stories is relationships. We also create our individual story, like in my story about being a professor who's fun. Socializing is what we do when we're trying to socialize people to values, norms, and beliefs, and this happens a lot in families when you hear stories about things in your family that are passed down. And then coping is telling stories to make sense of things that are difficult. This theory is at work in Narrative Nebraska, which Christina mentioned, and I told the students at this table I was going to show you a map of Nebraska. This is what Nebraska looks like. I live about here. I don't know much about over here. But what I do know is that our lab is really focused on looking at the impact of stories and the ways in which we can understand how narrative, content process, and empirical methods can be translated to help families and other kinds of participants, both within and outside the context of health. So, this particular theory is guided, communicated narrative sense making, is guided by then 3 heuristics, which we refer to as retrospective storytelling, interactional storytelling, and translational storytelling. And I want to talk about each one of those and show you some of the research that we've done in that area to give you a better understanding of the methods and findings that we've highlighted within this theory on our way to translating programs that can help people. So the first one we refer to as retrospective storytelling, and this is research on participants' recollections of storytelling in the family that affects and reflects family socialization. In other words, that I think is an even better description of this, is that these are the stories that we hear and that we tell that have a significant impact on us in some way. Those are retrospective stories. And so we have studied these in a number of different ways. Typically, when we are studying retrospective storytelling, and by the way, I should say that I'm going to give you examples of research from my lab and mine and my students' research, but this whole theory draws on an interdisciplinary set of studies. So other people are doing this work, and it's not ours by any means, but it's the way that we've organized it. But oftentimes when people are talking about stories that have had a significant impact on their lives, they're talking about canonical stories. So these are stories like family of origin stories. How did our family come to be? How did we meet, fall in love, and get married? Okay, Prezi, I'm sorry that I keep touching you. Breakup stories are significant stories of loss that we tell to, dress the graves of our relationships. Adoption entrance narratives. These are the canonical stories that families tell. And we found that they're linked and patterned ways to well-being. And we've also done a little bit of research on the fact that families create legacies through the stories they tell. So again, that socializing feature. That stories that we hear and that we tell repeatedly in the family become legacies that help to shape our individual and relational identity. All right, so what are some examples of what this looks like? So way back when, in another lifetime, I did a study on breakup stories. Jen, do you remember this?
Yes.
Yeah. Breakup stories are a canonical story that we often tell because when a relationship ends, it's a noteworthy event, and stories are called for when something noteworthy happens. And so we're often called to engage in what Duck and Raleigh later on called grave dressing, right? So it's our way to make sense of, but also put a spin on what happened in the breakup. So in this particular study, I'm just not supposed to start. We used the existing theory to make an argument that part of what needed to be looked at is how complete somebody's breakup story is. So in your mind, are you thinking of a breakup story right now? And if I asked you to tell it to the person sitting across from you, could you? Oh my gosh, I'm not gonna make you. You are looking at me like we hate you. I won't. But we wanted to study whether or not the ability to complete a narrative would help to explain how adjusted somebody was to the breakup, based on theorizing that suggested that the coherence and ability to put an end point on a narrative and really make sense of it in a coherent way should help people come to terms. But not very many people, if any, had tested this quantitatively. And so what we did is we had people write out a breakup story and fill out measures of post-breakup adjustment. And then we, based on the previous literature, created a rating scheme for narrative completeness that included how sequential and episodic the narrative was. So did it follow a timeline? Did it follow a beginning, middle, and end? And were there little episodes to illustrate the beginning, middle, and end? Were causes and consequences established in the story? Was there character development? Did they evoke and make sense of affect? Did they create